So
Yep.
I'll share something with you that you will not hear anywhere else.
Hey, welcome to Super Social Club. I'm Jeremy.
This is Whiskey and 6. I'm Rob.
Welcome to the Whiskey Rant Podcast.
It's a little crusty.
It's frustrating.
And it's going to be a little bit of a rant.
I don't understand it. I don't know why.
Some sort of injustice.
Anyway, end rant.
Hello and welcome back to the Whiskey Rant Podcast. I'm Jeremy.
I'm Rob.
And again, we have a legend amongst us. Ralfy, thank you so much for coming back on the channel. The original Whiskey Ranter. Ralfy, how are you?
Hello, chaps. Lovely to be joining you. And I'm absolutely delighted that I have not been banned for life from your channel for opinions and slightly controversial perspectives. I'm looking forward to your questions, so fire away.
That's what we're all about on this. And we actually loved having you on the first time. So we thought, who better to have than Ralfy?
I mean, this podcast is inspired by your channel, and we don't
Absolutely.
hold back with what we say on here either. And we want to talk to you about kind of extras that you came out with. One of your most passionate, I would say, kind of rants. And that's a topic that you had talked to us briefly about before.
Yeah.
And that's another Canadian distillery getting a little bit of buzz from the Scotch Whisky Association for another distillery using a Scottish-like name in their distillery, and that's the Caledonian Distillery in BC, in Victoria.
Yeah, Macaloni's is the name of the actual brand, I guess. Macaloni's Caledonian, and this one in particular is a year old exactly, so they can't actually call it whiskey. 46%, but it's the only one that was available at the LCBO. Picked it up so that we could talk about it today. Have you had a chance to try it yet, Ralfy?
It is completely unobtainable where I am, but could I just say I find it highly amusing that with your Canadian politeness, you're describing a lawyer's letter from the Scotch Whisky Association as, quote, a little bit of buzz.
You define it a little more drastic than that. So what do you know? Like, if you want to just kind of reiterate briefly what your rant was about.
Right. The rant started really back in 2008 when I was kind of starting to explore more of the diverse alternatives to Scotch whisky, which were becoming available through London retailers and that you could buy online. Because that's the great advantage of the big online specialist retailer, is they can bring in these very small batches of curiosities that you've never encountered before and give you a chance to buy a bottle and check it out. And one of those bottles was a Canadian whiskey from Glenora Distillery called Glenbreton. It was 10 years old. It was very light coloured and I was very intrigued. And so I bought a bottle. And at that point, when I was checking out online, doing a little bit of malt research, that's when I discovered that there was a lawsuit taking place where the Scotch Whisky Association were objecting to the use of the word Glen in Glenbreton as a bottling, despite the fact that it very clearly stated in the label that the whiskey was made in Canada, and then on top of that, it had a great big visible red maple leaf, for those that didn't want to read the words. And that's really what kick-started Ralfy.com as a whiskey review channel, because it had an accident when I tripped over a scooter on a sand dune in St Andrews in the east coast of Scotland. And for the first time in my working life, I was off for a prolonged period because I had damaged my shoulder quite badly. So I wasn't fit for work. So once the pain had subsided, it was my brother suggested that I get a little video camera and do something on YouTube, which was only 4 years old. It started in 2004, 2005. And I mean, these were the early days, guys. This was, I was loading files in dial-up.
Yeah, I remember those days. It was pre-Bothy days, right?
Yeah.
Pre-Bothy days, yes. When I was in the back room of the house and reading off my carefully noted whiskey script, and so as to get the descriptors in. So we've moved on a bit since then, but that's actually been, 12 years now. And it was a Canadian whiskey that really started it, which now appears as Ralfy Review number 2. Because I put Talisker 10-year-old as Ralfy Review number 1, simply because it was a very visible Scotch whisky, and that's what my channel was about. And I got absolutely no audience at all until someone slagged me off online, which of course is the best sort of publicity you can get. And then within 2 weeks, I had 1,000 subscribers, and I've never looked back. And that was a situation in which the actions of the Scotch Whisky Association had quite a significant input. It was a valuable motivator because as a Scotsman, I really took cultural offence to the appropriation of authentic Scottish culture by a trade representative body for purely commercial expediency and convenience, when in fact there is a huge Scottish culture present in the modern nation that is Canada, and to try and dismiss it, negate it, and cancel culture it is just absurd. And in fact, one of the words I used, now that it's reared its ugly head again with the victimization of Macaloni's, single malt Canadian whiskey, malted barley whiskey from Victoria and Vancouver Island, is that I regard it as a form of cultural racism, that the Scotch Whisky Association are claiming that they own Scottish references for their product, which they appropriated purely by default and their own convenience many, many years ago, simply as a form of marketing identity. I don't think they have any right to do this. And furthermore, I think they're wasting a considerable amount of money supplied by buyers of Scotch whisky on this action. They didn't win last time, and I don't see them winning this time. And I think I'm going to add to it a little bit. Guys, you know to expect me to be a little long-winded in my answers, so I'm just going to push on through because this matters. And that is the fact that there is evidence to show that the Scotch Whisky Association approached the European distributor for Macaloni's whiskey and asked them to stop distributing Macaloni's whiskey because it had the word Mac in it. It had Scottish references. Wow. And that's all very well if you've got a German distillery that just shoehorns in the word Glen or Mac or anything. Now, that's legitimate. I think in that instance, the Scotch Whisky Association are right. But when Macaloni's have done absolutely nothing wrong in Canada, the country which is the source of their whiskey, then they should not be facing this preemptive action to cancel their product in a market due to the action of the Scotch Whisky Association, which appears, and I'm picking my words carefully, which appears, as far as I am aware, to be applying unreasonable harassment pressure on a distributor simply by virtue of them going about their perfectly legal and legitimate business. That is risky and that is dangerous. And I think that some senior decisions makers in the Scotch Whisky Association need to take a big deep breath and re-examine the situation carefully.
Yeah, I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, Graham McAloney is the owner of the distillery. He's using
his own name,
given surname as a distillery name. I mean, I don't know where the Scotch Whisky Association really has a leg in this. I get Caledonia, Caledonia is the old Latin word for Scotland, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. That is correct, yes.
I mean, I get that the Scotch Whisky Association wants to protect their brand and they want Scotch whisky to be Scotch produced. There nowhere on this does it say the word Scotch. It says product of Canada right on the back. It's not even called whiskey. I mean, this bottle's not.
No.
I don't get the muscle flex it seems like they're trying to produce here with their lawyers and really trying to set a precedent that if you put any word that is associated with us in your bottle, we're going to come after you.
Yeah, and to piggyback on both of your comments, even Caledonia, that there's places in Ontario called Caledonia. There's townships, and and small cities that are called Caledonia. So how do you stop someone from naming like Macaloni's from Caledonia? Well, where he's from, it could be very well be a Caledonia in BC or in Vancouver Island or Victoria. Sorry, it's very silly to me to say you can't use your own name because it sounds too Scottish,
Right.
and we're gonna mistake other people. Consumers are gonna mistake it for Scotch, and I also don't understand. And maybe you could speak to this. What's the fear? What is the Scotch Whisky Society so afraid of? Like, we live in 2022 where people are producing whiskey all over the world, and imitation is the best form of flattery. And ultimately, if Scotland's producing their whiskey at a high quality and they continue to do so, then they really don't have anything to worry about, do they?
And they do have something to worry about if not all their whiskey is produced to high quality.
Right.
And in fact, in the global market, if they're outperformed by other countries producing better quality spirit at a better and more accessible price.
Mm-hmm.
It's simple commercial instinct. And to add a little bit more to this current conversation, there's a real inconsistency which looks really quite unprofessional. And that is the fact that Macaloni's have quite literally been singled out, yet McCarthy's Oregon single malt whiskey in the US hasn't, as far as I'm aware. Glendalough Irish Whiskey Distillery in Ireland hasn't been singled out, as far as I'm aware. Macmura in Sweden hasn't been singled out for Mac, as far as I'm aware. And how about Bagpiper and McDowell's in India? These are clearly appropriated Scottish references that are familiar with Scottish brands, which are on Indian and clearly identified on Indian whiskey. So there is a significant selectivity going on, which really draws attention to the fact that perhaps there are some decision makers in the Scotch whisky industry that are concerned about the capacity of Canada to produce consistent world-class single malt whiskey, which begins to outperform some brands of Scotch whisky, because the intrinsic quality of these Scotch whisky brands is unfortunately starting to be neglected.
Yeah, and it's funny is while you're speaking, a light bulb just went off. Is, you know, geographically speaking, there's parts of Canada that are very similar in climate to Scotland, and there's parts of Canada that, I mean, on the map, like you can almost draw a line across from Scotland to parts of Canada. So I wonder if that's the fear, is that the similarity in climate could lead to, like Ralfy's suggesting, just equal, if not better quality. Now, I think where Scotch will always have a huge advantage is that Macaloni's and Shelter Point and Two Brewers, which are in my opinion, the up and coming single malt producers in this country, their disadvantage is they're new to the game. So the cost of producing is so much higher. Whereas Scotland has these distilleries for years and years and years. So the product, like, they can charge, this was $123 as a 1-year-old single malt, right? Whereas, you know, $123 gets you an 18-year-old single malt from Scotland. You know what I mean? So there's a big price difference, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to touch that.
Yeah, and I think that, like, distinguishing whiskey from regions, I don't disagree that the Scotch Whisky Association, you know, is Scotch. That is the name that distinguishes Scotch from other whiskeys. There was a great example about Diageo, Crown Royal, one of the biggest brands in Canada, if not the biggest,
Right.
came out with what they called bourbon mash, and it had the word bourbon mash written on the front label.
Right.
That got approved by the tax in whatever bureau in the US to be approved. They immediately reneged on that and took it back after the word bourbon could not be displayed on a Canadian whiskey,
Right.
even though it was made like bourbon with a mash.
Yep.
So that got yanked. And that I don't really have a problem with. If you're putting the word bourbon on the front label, it should be following the bourbon rules.
Yeah, I agree. A bourbon should be made in the US. Like that's part of the rules, and that's what it should be. Just like I don't think Canadian whiskey should ever, it doesn't matter how similar it tastes or whether it's better or not, it should never be able to put Scotch on the label, of course, right? So
and they're not doing that.
They're
right?
not doing
this is not saying anywhere on it that it's Scotch whiskey.
Right.
Quite important is the fact that as soon as any identity is taken by appropriation, you lose the quality of your own authenticity, of your reputation that others can't appropriate. And there should be absolutely no shame or misgivings about having absolute pride, not just on what Canadian whiskey is and the variations and diversity of Canadian whiskey, but what it is capable of. And frankly, we're simply not seeing best versions of Canadian whiskey in the UK market because it isn't bottled and made available. As I mentioned earlier, small batch or single cask with an age statement, higher strength, 46% is ideal, or cask strength, marked as unchill filtered and natural colour. Now, I've got a bottle in front of me, guys, of lot 40. It's bottled at 43%. It is 100% Canadian rye, matured in fresh oak casks, not reclaimed casks, not salvaged casks that have been seasoned with sherry or previously contained bourbon. These are new wood casks, and the result is excellent. The balance, the poise, the character, a mellow version of rye whiskey, which you simply don't get in the US, which is much more feisty and aggressive in whatever form it takes, including wild turkey and you know, all the other options. And I really look at, I've got a global overview. I've started with Scotch, but I really do have a global overview now, talking not just to whiskey distillers outside of Scotland, but rum distillers, brandy distillers in South America. I'm getting a very unique insight into the globalization of whiskey and matured spirit culture. And what I notice is that the domination of Scotch whiskey is very much visible in the conversations you find online, but there are other gems out there which, with a little bit of tweaking and tucking and a better caliber of presentation, can take on Scotch whiskey anytime. And I say that as someone who is Scottish and who cares deeply about the quality of Scotch whiskey, because that and that alone is what will preserve the reputation of Scotch whiskey in the future, and the jobs and the economy and the sense of identity that Scotland needs from whiskey. It's got to be about quality, which is why, along with Roy Duff, I co-founded the online Scotch Whisky Awards to promote that, to give very visible, direct and tangible feedback directly to the industry about where what they call the consumers, but we're customers, where we are at, the informed, articulate, self-educated customers that do our apprenticeship in smell and taste over years and years. We pay the premium, but we expect to be rewarded for it. And when we're going out into the market and we're buying relatively familiar brands and we're initially doubting ourselves, hang about, this isn't what it used to be. This whiskey is reasonable enough, but look at the price I'm paying and look at what I'm getting. It's the smell and taste. It's not quite what it was. And as soon as that happens, it's very quickly discussed, and people to start to look around for other options. And I find it fascinating, in particular, watching the rum scene and seeing these rums that are now appearing in my radar, which I never even knew existed, like Beanley from Australia, a 5-year-old Beanley rum, fantastic stuff, absolutely amazing. And I know for a fact that when I review it in a few weeks' time, and I mention that your Australian malt mates and whiskey drinkers are going to say, hang about, Why should I pay good money for a bad whiskey from Scotland when I can get a good rum from Australia?
Yeah,
From my own country.
it's a good point.
Yeah, that's a good point going to back on your point about the Scotch Whisky online, Scotch Whisky Awards, and really with the focus of quality and good value for money. Ralfy, you've been along the ride for a very, very long time. You've seen the ups and downs of the market. Do you remember in 2013, you reviewed a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle 20-year-old Kentucky Straight Bourbon? Do you remember what you paid for that bottle at the time?
Yeah, £95, $190.
Do you keep up to date with current market trends on, super collectible bourbons or other Scotch whiskies like that? Do you have any idea what that bottle goes for nowadays?
Yes, I do. You mentioned earlier, Jeremy, the ups and downs of whiskey. During my time as a reviewer, it's generally been up and up and up, and it can only go so far. Something's going to give because something always does.
Yeah, I want your opinion on that, because obviously the whiskey market now, it seems like whiskey in general, it's become more of almost like a stock commodity where it's it's purchased, it's not meant to be drank, it's more of a collector and an investment opportunity.
It's an NFT. It's a tangible NFT.
Bottles just exchange hands, they never get opened. It's a stock, it's not a consumable anymore.
That's right.
Where do you see this going? Is there going to be a bust? Because I know a lot of people keep saying that. They keep saying about the housing market here, it never happens. It hasn't happened yet.
Not yet.
The prices keep going up. You say that it needs to come to an end. Where do you see the whiskey market as far as collectability, investment opportunities are going in the future?
Right. I'll start with what Rob's just said, that whiskey is a tangible NFT, non-fungible token. Non-fungible tokens are basically based on the greater fool theory of investment, that I'll buy something and I'll pay something for it, and sooner or later someone will pay more. This is the old trick, whether it be back in the 17th, 18th century with Dutch tulips, or more recently with Swiss watches, vintage French handbags. You have these alternative commodities which have become asset class investments. We've now, to understand this, you've got to look at the last 10 years of the global stock market, in particular the S&P 500 and the New York Stock Exchange, which represents the top performing 500 companies. And they have absolutely soared in value due to a combination of wishful thinking, greater fool theory principle, and low interest rates. And you have people who are borrowing money to invest because they've only known the good times of the last 10 years. Now, this has led to an overinflated market where, if you know about these things, the price to earnings ratio has got higher and higher and higher for many companies, so that in fact for real investors it's been a very bad time to buy. They're holding off until the stock market crashes, so that long-term institutional investors have been diversifying out of the stock market, particularly hedge funds, and they've been looking for other ways in which to tangibly invest their wealth with some sort of perceived security. And so they get in at the bottom of the elevator, so to speak, and they'll buy up some Swiss watches, some vintage wines. They'll then pump it and promote it, rather like cryptocurrencies before cryptocurrency appeared. And then up it goes in value, it becomes fashionable. And you talk to any antiques dealer, you will find that certain styles of porcelain, pottery, artworks, watercolors, silverware, it becomes fashionable, the price rockets, then people lose interest, and then it crashes back down again, and the whole thing rinses and repeats. And that is what's happening with whiskey. I'll start with the traditional auction market, where they've had the few dusty old bottles, which have gone for about 3 or 4 times the original price, and they're generally bought by enthusiasts and traditional whiskey collectors that just want a big bundle of bottles in their cellar. That's long since gone. You now have a new generation who are monitoring, who even have bespoke computer algorithms to monitor what's selling at which online auction, which traditional auction, what the prices in retail prices in shops. They put it through the calculation matrix and come out with it. Rightio, this whiskey is going to be the next big thing, the next big inflatable hedge. Great example, Daffmill. Really good example. Old Macallans are still doing it simply because for the people with money and absolutely no clue about whiskey, they're very identifiable and people can just latch onto them. And they're presented as outrageously inflated collectibles. And I really think that this is going to come back and bite Macallan badly, because not that long ago, they did a range of non-age statement Macallans, which frankly were not very good. And before that, they had a fine oak series of ex-bourbon cask matured Macallans, which they bought back from an independent bottler. And some of them, frankly, were crap.
Yeah.
They really weren't good.
Sure.
And when I complained to Macallan about it, I get completely blanked. And I tell you what, I once made a complaint to Diageo about a bottle of Talisker. And nobody has given me more professional response than Diageo.
Oh, wow.
They gave me a very simple, civil reply. We're going to send you a package. Please send the bottle back to us. We will examine it. That's what I did. They then, obviously, they tested to make sure it was authentic and original. They chemically analysed it and all the rest of it for any possible contamination, and then send me vouchers to replace the value of it. Nobody has treated me more professionally in the course of a complaint than Diageo. But having said that, I very rarely have cause to complain to any small distilleries, because small distilleries is where my focus is. And recently I've done a run of widely available mainstream brand single malts, some of which are fine, some of which are most definitely not fine. And I'm just being honest. That's all it is. It remains an opinion and a perspective. But it's the little distilleries that and independent bottlers is just where my interest is gravitating to, because you have less leverage going on from collectors in that sector who are churning up the price, because as soon as a bottle goes into auction, it starts to get pumped. And I'm going to tell you exactly how they pump a bottle. What happens is a small distillery may bring out their inaugural release, or alternatively, an independent bottler brings out a particularly good version of some whiskey. So what happens is this gets spotted on the bespoke algorithm of the speculator, and they go out into the market and they buy as much of that batch as they possibly can. So they'll approach retailers and say, I'm not in to buy a bottle. I will give you 50% extra to buy all your cases. Some retailers knock them back. Other retailers sell them. And yet more retailers say, hang about, something's happening. We'll sell one bottle and we'll hold the rest in the back of the shop and see what happens to it. And then what they do is they put a single bottle out that batch into several auctions, and they make sure that their buddies pay 4 times the original price for it. That triggers the demand. That triggers the conversation, which they stimulate through social media. And then all of a sudden, there's a feeding frenzy for that particular version of a whiskey, at which the speculator has got a monopoly of the releases, well, as much as they possibly can. Even if they don't have much, they've still got a head start on most. So never underestimate the amount of manipulation that goes on. And it's not just fakes. Fakes are appearing in auction.
Wow.
They're still out there. Doesn't get much of a conversation, guys. I mean, this is one reason when I'm looking at an auction, I'm not looking at Scotch whisky anymore. because everybody's attention's in that. I'm looking at some rums, Canadian whiskies, cognacs, mezcals, because the chances of them not being fakes are about 90 to 1, if not more.
Yes.
It's probably 99 to 1.
We've seen that happen before. We've seen that happen with Weller when they release a new bourbon, like the full proof or
Right.
the single barrel.
Right.
We'll see the secondary market and we'll see manipulation when people will come in. Who's going to set the price of this new release? What's it going to be at? And someone will come in and bump up that bottle and have stock of it in the background. We're seeing it in real time right now with Macallan Harmony.
Yep.
There's people on Instagram, they're bragging about 100 cases that they purchased, went through the entire state of Florida and bought up as much as they possibly could. Entire wall of Macallan boxes of Harmony. And their comments would be like, look at the UK auctions, look where this is going. This is going to get to 800 pounds by the end of the year. Here's my investment, here's my retirement, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's right. It's just false manipulation because that whiskey not worth 800 pounds.
No, absolutely not. I mean, an argument can be made that probably very few, if any, whiskeys are worth 800 pounds. But
Sure.
you know, I mean, look at the new Springbank. Well, not new. It's 2020 now, so 2 years almost old. But the Springbank 10 local barley, just because it has a few shades darker color to it than previous batches, it's like, I think the last time I checked, €1,600 on Whiskey Base or something like that. So
yeah, and Ralfy, like we're starting to experience whiskeys that we were accustomed to finding and paying a decent price for.
Yeah.
You have, I'm sure, loads of bottles that you were like, oh, I could get this anytime I wanted to for a good price, and now it's not on any shelves. And if I want it, I'm paying 5 times what I used to pay. Where is there anything like that you've experienced recently? I mean, I'm sure you have lots, but
Well, I'll tell you the story about the Pappy Van Winkle.
yeah.
I went into the Good Spirits Company. It's a small shop in Glasgow. And what I like them about Good Spirits Company is I remember these folks when they worked for a much larger retailer called Oddbins. And that's where they did their apprenticeship. And they saw the opportunity for a one-off specialist bottle shop, sourcing less obvious bottlings and selling them at accessible prices out with the London market, because of course they're based in Glasgow. And it's not just whiskey, it's rum, bourbons, rye, Canadian whiskies, and other more exotic liquors, like, for example, specialist Italian vermouths, of which they have. I bought a bottle recently and it was just such a fantastic alternative. And so I've kind of followed their progress with interest, because they're rather like a small shop is like a small distillery. When you know the people personally, you know their backstory, you get to know where they're going. You're not getting any sanitized version. You get an honest reading of what's what. And also they've made me welcome when I've popped my head through the door. Like some small, there's some small distilleries I just wouldn't visit because, frankly, I'd get a frosty reception. Whereas there's other distilleries, they're delighted to see me. They know just to give me a cup of tea and a wee dram, and I walk through the premises, and everything's absolutely fine, and we can sort of, just have a kind of general chat and shoot the breeze, so to speak, for a few hours, and it's a good one. I might even record something at the distillery, although I've not done that recently due to pandemic lockdown. But I went into the Good Spirits Company really to do a walk-through video, just showing what's on the shelves of a specialist whiskey shop in Scotland, because people are interested. And I happened to be, as I was scanning along, there was a single solitary bottle of Pappy Van Winkle, 20 or 21-year-old, I think 20-year-old, and it was £90 a bottle. And I got a comment from a malt mate saying, hey, Ralfy, see that price, buy it. So I phoned up the shop and said, right, can I buy that bourbon-y thing? I'm not planning any bourbon reviews, but what the hell, So I bought it, they posted it out to me, and I thought, right, well, let's do a review on this. just at the point where it was starting to be pumped like mad. And I have to say, I found it quite entertaining to see the outrageous hype that Pappy Van Winkle producers have engaged in. Their sense of melodrama, theatre, and exploitation of gullible consumers who are paying far too much for far too little and don't have the sense to realize the difference.
Yeah, recent auction prices that I've seen. Now, provided that your bottle, you reviewed it in 2013, you may have had a 2012 bottling. That would have been the last year of potential Stitzel Weller distillate, which those command more money on the secondary market. About $3,000 US, 2,600 British pounds is where that bottle kind of is right now, give or take. I'm sure it's even more. So yeah, I mean, 20 times almost what you paid, or it's five, 6. I mean, it's crazy to see the elevation of the market with those.
Let me ask you a question here, guys. Give me a ratio, 100 to 1. What percentage of Pappy Van Winkles are potentially fakes?
Ooh.
That's a good question. Quite a few, I would say. The secondary groups that I've been a part of, and they've done a good job of scoping out fakes, recording the bottle number on that, and spreading that information around.
Okay.
But I would say quite a few, especially when people are selling through social media accounts, right? And there's really no way of betting them. I would say quite a bit. I mean, percentage-wise, I don't know, maybe like 25% of all transactions that we do. I
think you got to be wary of every time a bottle of Pappy is open, that you once you consume that bottle, you should smash it, because the odds are, if what does an empty go for? I bet you can make your money back just on the empty, just because they know that they can refill it with garbage.
Oh, there's a huge market for empties. Yeah.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So it's almost like the onus is on the consumer to smash that bottle, because it will end up. So pretty much the entirety of what these guys can get their hands on as far as empty bottles, which is, I mean, a more, I would say an easier question to ask would be how many actual bottles of Pappy Van Winkle are open, and that's probably like in the low, like under 10%. Under 10%. Sorry for all the background noise. Because of the time, my children are still wide awake and upstairs. So.
Oh, bless them. Now, just to kind of bring just to a wee point you made there, Rob. It's up to the buyers and the consumers of Pappy Van Winkle to smash the bottle once it's empty. Well, I got to tell you, from where I'm sitting in the bothy, I don't hear the sound of breaking glass anywhere.
Yeah.
Be realistic about it.
It's true. I know. And I guess that's not a realistic expectation. It's just, it would, if there was a little disclaimer on each bottle, please dispose of this glass or something, just because of that,
Yeah. I mean, the small database of serial numbers and fake stuff, I mean, it was distributed decently among that group, but people outside that group, I mean, they have no idea. And, the average consumer, they hear the word Pappy Van Winkle and automatically they trigger that's a really expensive bourbon. And someone who doesn't know that much could easily buy that bottle as a gift, as whatever. And completely fake.
So a little sidebar here. Perhaps I have a little bit of a feeling as to why the Scotch Whisky Society went after this bottling.
Does it taste like Scotch?
At 1 year old, I've had whiskeys from everywhere that are not as good as that. At 1 year old. So, and I don't know anything about this bottle. There's not a lot of information. There is an ingredients list at the back, which is just water, barley, and yeast, which I like. I like to see the ingredients on the back, which I would assume if that's on the back, then there is no E150 or anything else added. It says non-chill filtered on the front. It is 46%.
Right.
1 year old.
Just to give you some insight, you can't actually state ingredients in Scotch whisky.
Right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah,
So to actually state ingredients as ingredients on a Canadian whiskey is a major form of disclosure. It's a serious form of disclosure. By far, the majority of Scotch whisky producers make no mention of what the product is made of. And the only exception really is the cooperative supermarket, who have a content list rather than ingredients of what's in the bottle, which is alcoholic beverage and E150 colorant. And that's basically it. Now, as something I want to just bring to your attention, because discussing the context in the context of that Pappy Van Winkle, there's a book that I would recommend, highly recommend to your listeners, and it's called The Billionaire's Vinegar, by Benjamin Wallace. And it's something that you can pick up, say, as a Kindle edition for $8, £8.50, or a paperback for about £12. And I bought a copy of that, and it gives a very insightful, entertaining, and very professionally presented, detailed insight to the wine racket in the 1990s. And I think that the whiskey scene situation at the moment very much reflects and is in parallel with what happened in the 1990s, where you had prominent individuals, one in the US and one in Europe. There's a guy called Hardy Rodenstock in Europe and Rudy Caruzawan in the US, who basically pandered to people's snobbery and pretensions by having these rarer and rarer wine gatherings and meetings, selling bottles privately at considerable expense, many of which were in fact fakes. And this book gives you some really good, very well researched detail into it. And I think that's the best singular form of reference for anyone who's into whiskey and wanting to know what's going to happen next with the overinflated and overpriced whiskey scene, which is getting harder to sustain because we're now in a period of economic inflation and hardship. Disposable consumer income is reducing significantly in the short term with rising energy prices, rent rates, and general cost of living. People are cutting back. And one reason they're saying is, I'm cutting back for my health, because more and more, due to social profiling, when people are looking to get jobs or get promotion in their jobs, or whether they're looking to get health insurance or a better rate of house insurance, or whether they want to improve their social credit rating or their monetary credit rating, they're going to organizations who are paying money to companies who siphon and harvest personal information off the internet. And when anyone appears pished in a video on Facebook or Instagram or any other social platform, particularly if they're behaving in what is perceived to be belligerent, aggressive, or any other cancel culture style behavior, this is going to have serious impact. And people are now just putting the pieces together in this and saying, hang about, I've got to be careful about where and when I'm drinking alcohol.
Yep.
I cannot stand in a pub and just give off my opinion after half a dozen whiskeys the way I used to, because someone's standing 6 feet away with their mobile phone, pretending to be texting, recording it all, and then seeing how much they can make out of it on their social media platform.
Wouldn't that be a great Ralfy's extras?
When it comes to doxing, I do it myself.
And I think that's a great message for, especially like even people younger than us with social media the way it is. I mean, our age group, we've kind of got to the outskirts of that where it hasn't been in our most vulnerable times.
Yeah.
I can't imagine in our early 20s, late teens with social media the way it is nowadays.
Yeah. So, well, the books, Ralfy, why don't you tell us really quickly where they can find your books and.
Oh, bless. Thanks for the plug, guys. I've got 2 books published, self-published, with both on Amazon, but also in bookshops as well, because as at the end of the pandemic, as bookshops open, they're checking to see what is selling online so they know what to stock. So I've got Search for a Whiskey Bothy, which is my first book, which is really just the journey from my first drop of whiskey to actually arriving at the bothy and setting up my little malt base here. And the second book is Stories from a Whiskey Bar, which is a couple of chapters left over that didn't fit into the first book. And then I've added more. They're fictional stories, but they're factually based. And they're just the characters I've met over the years in relation to whiskey. So the stories are not necessarily about, some of the stories are not necessarily about whiskey, but about the characters and their relationship with whiskies. So I've got a historical chapter in there called The Year is 1824, which was a hugely important year for Scotch whisky. And I did some historical research and spoke to an antiquarian about it. And actually visited a few years ago the site of an old hooching still up in the banks of Loch Lomond, and put it all into context in a chapter there in that book. And my third book I'm writing at the moment is Life, Death and Whiskey, which is really more about my connection with whiskey through being an undertaker for over 20 years. Because when you're dealing with life and death, because the two are inseparable, it has a bearing in how you connect with whiskey. You don't connect with whiskey sentimentally so much as you can connect with it philosophically, because of the gravity and the situations you come across in the job, whether it be something horrendous or something absolutely ridiculous, because you get so many sometimes bizarre situations in that job. And throughout it all, you've got the character that is Glasgow, the city, which is a fascinating city, which I can never quite remove myself from. And inevitably, I do find myself in a Highland bothy, somewhere in Scotland, musing under the stars, and discoursing about UFOs.
That's the beauty about whiskey, right? It always leads to conversations, and that's what we love about it.
Absolutely.
Ralfy, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure having you on. We are huge fans from the very beginning, and it's always an honor for us to speak with you.
Wonderful. I'm not going to get you banned from social media now with my forthright and insensitive comments.
Not at all.
I think we've said the things that if we haven't got banned by now, we might not get banned.
Yeah, I'm hoping to make this at least an annual thing, and if you're willing, that would be a great thing. Absolutely.
If we're not breaking the set, and if we're not talking some controversial content, we're not doing due justice and due diligence to the world of whiskey, because that's what whiskey is all about.
Absolutely. Well, perhaps
whether some big companies like it or not, and some small ones.
Ralfy, it's been great. Thank you so much for joining us, and
thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ralfy. Really, really appreciate it.
Cheers.
You're very welcome.
Next time on the Whisky Rant Podcast.
I am speaking to Bowmore because I just acquired the 21-year-old Aston Martin. When Bowmore wants to, have you tried it yet, Ralfie?
Absolutely wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. No chance. No chance. You've got to be kidding me. It's the Aston Martin. Oh, it's a big, high prestige mark. Look at it, and they've got the logo on it. How much do you think Bowmore have paid for that?